What did we usually associate France with before? In recent years, it has been more associated with the political crisis, pogroms, and illiterate migration policy. We will talk about the latter today, because this is partly due to the pogroms and the political crisis. But let's start from the beginning. In general, migration to France began in the middle of the 19th century, just at the peak of the industrial development of society. The migration policy of those times was carried out for two reasons. On the one hand, it was to meet the country's demand for labor, as well as improve the demographic situation. Most of the migrants at that time were from neighboring countries, such as Belgium and Italy. France has become a haven for many military and political refugees. For example, Russians who fled the Bolshevik Revolution, or the Armenians who were persecuted by the Turks during the First World War. And in general, many migrants successfully integrated into French society, and until the end of the First World War, their number remained around 3% of the total population. The French themselves call this the first wave of migration. The second wave of migration began after the First World War. It was already much more widespread. First of all, it was also labor migration, because there were also not enough workers in France after the First World War, and the wage conditions were much higher than in many European countries, not to mention the African colonies. Emigrants were already coming not only from Italy and Belgium, but from Spain, Poland, and from colonies throughout North Africa. In 1931, there were already almost 3 million migrants in the country. This is 7% of the population. However, most of them were temporary workers. They had no intention of settling permanently in France. Therefore, during the years of the economic crisis of the 30s and the period of the Second World War, not only the influx of migrants stopped, but the number of those who had already arrived was almost halved. Therefore, it is not surprising that the end of World War II did not change France's open migration policy. So, in 1945, the immigration law was adopted, which consolidated the current migration policy. It is thanks to this and the efforts to rebuild the country after the war that the next wave of migration falls in the 50s and 70s. By 1976, there were already about 4 million migrants in France. That's 7% of the population. In the 50s, the birth rate gap between the French and immigrants was already beginning. Arab families have an average of 5 to 6 children. The Portuguese have 3 children each. The natives have no more than 2. And as the emigrants settled in France, the birth rate in their families decreased somewhat, but still remained significantly higher than in the French. But still, the third wave, like the second, was still working. And usually after 3 to 5 years of work in France, many returned back to their homeland. However, gradually, the number of those who settled increased. They had children who were born in France and had never been to their homeland. As a result of uncontrolled migration and the economic downturn in the 70s, France began to experience a sharp jump in unemployment. As a result, the French government was forced to stop accepting migrants. In the mid-70s, there was even a ban on hiring foreign labor, and the government imposed its own sanctions on those employers who fell for it. The fourth wave of migration began already in the mid-80s. They were mostly Africans already. They were going not so much to work as to live in France. Several factors worked here at once. First, the economic situation in most of France's neighboring countries has improved. That is why the number of migrants from Portugal, Spain, and Italy has drastically decreased. Secondly, a significant part of the third wave of migrations settled in France, and therefore their own Arab districts were already formed in French cities, where the bulk were Arabs who were already born in France. All this happened despite the fact that up to the end of the 90s, the policy of restricting migration was maintained. The main goal was to achieve a zero rate of illegal migration. The rules for obtaining French citizenship have even been tightened. However, already in the late 90s, the political course in France changed again, and restrictions were relaxed. As a result, a significant number of illegal migrants were granted amnesty. The rule of obtaining citizenship was also returned. If your child was born in this country, then he is automatically a citizen of it. Social policy has also changed. The newly arriving Arabs now occupied jobs that their naturalized compatriots did not want to occupy, because they chose to live on benefits. The fourth wave of migrants went to France, not to work, but simply to live there. Today, 1/3 of the Republic's population is not of French origin. These are mostly people with a French passport, but they are descendants of immigrants from North Africa and other regions. These are people who adhere to a different religion, culture, and therefore a different way of life. And the problem of migrants is becoming even more acute. These people only want to live in their neighborhoods among the same guys. They don't want to work. They only want to receive benefits. Partly because of this, the level of crime and discontent among the indigenous population of France is growing. This is not surprising. Migrants of recent decades have not massively integrated into the economy, are not engaged in business, and do not receive a decent education, despite efforts to integrate those staying. Unlike migrants of the 20th century, they tend to create national neighborhoods and ethnic criminal businesses. Why do the indigenous people of France not want to live next to migrants and prefer to simply move? Yes, because they are uncomfortable, unsafe, or uncomfortable there. In fact, they feel the way migrants who came to their country felt in their homeland. It's a paradox, isn't it? People leave their homes and families, go for a better life. As a result, in their new homeland, they arrange life and everyday life on the model of the old one, not realizing that it was bad rules that made their former existence difficult and unbearable. As for unemployment, it is worth noting that the reasons for the high level among migrants are the instability of their status in France. The level of education, which is often below the national average, has less experience in the French labor market and poor command of the French language, especially among new migrants. There is also an increase in the number of illegal migrants who work on the black market. Migration flows have caused the Islamization of French society, which generates various religious and interethnic conflicts. In France, the proportion of the population professing Islam ranges from 4 to 9%, and this is one of the highest rates among European countries. The vast majority of Muslims in France are migrants and descendants of migrant workers. Minorities living on the outskirts of French cities have become the main support for the spread of Islamic ideology. Muslim groups began to make demands for the adoption of Islam as a norm of social life, which of course does not correspond to the current attitude of the French towards the Islamic religion. Ordinary French people are far from delighted with this. However, migrants alone should not be blamed for the migration crisis. To the same extent, the French authorities are responsible for this, which for many years ignored their citizens and their discontent about this. Hence, it is not surprising to see news that the right is beginning to gain popularity in many European countries, which have also been overtaken by this migration crisis. Why do you think that is? The answer is simple. They make migration a top priority and promise to radically solve this problem. Therefore, they receive support from the indigenous population of the country. Thus, it turns out that while there are few migrants, the population is effective. But when there are too many of them, they seem to get stuck in their own traditions and identity, and the local population already rejects them as alien. As a result, the host country receives ghettos, mutual hatred, and pogroms. It was on these rakes that France stepped at one time. And although today the government is aware of its mistakes and is trying in every possible way to start solving this problem, but whether it will be solved in the coming years is a big question. But as they say, better late than never. After all, migration policy is a rather complicated process that must be properly regulated by the state, and this applies not only to France, but also to all other countries. Thanks to everyone who watched this video to the end. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, support it with your likes, and share your opinion in the comments, and see you soon.